Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The afternoon was so idyllic in St. Mary Mead that it could have been a scene cut from an old postcard. The village, nestled deep in the heart of rural England, was the epitome of charm. Quiet cobblestone lanes, cottages with ivy-clad walls, and gardens brimming with the colours of summer. The sun shone down gently on the scene, casting soft rays through the ancient oaks and creating a peaceful, almost nostalgic atmosphere. It was on such a perfect afternoon that Mrs. Violet Stroud had chosen to host one of her regular garden parties. Her home, a large Victorian house with a well-manicured lawn and hedges that curved like protective arms around the property, was the ideal setting for the gathering. The house was an old relic of a time when St. Mary Mead had been home to gentry and aristocrats. And though Mrs. Stroud herself was not of such heritage, she carried herself with an air of dignity that suggested she thought she might as well have been. She was a rotund woman, tall for her age, with greying curls that framed her round face. Her attire, as always, was impeccable. A pastel lavender dress that swished just below her knees, and a wide-brimmed hat adorned with silk flowers. She had a kind smile that could turn sharp as a dagger at a moment's notice, and she was particularly adept at directing the flow of conversation. But for all her presence, she also had a tendency to appear ever so slightly self-important. And perhaps this was what made her so adept at hosting these gatherings. Everyone who came to her garden knew their place. Among the guests was Miss Emily Cartwright, an elderly woman who had lived in St. Mary Mead for as long as anyone could remember. With her silver spectacles perched delicately on her nose and her soft hands folded in her lap, Emily was the village's unassuming historian. Her memory was a treasure trove of village gossip, past scandals and forgotten feuds, and as she sat in her wicker chair, she spoke occasionally, offering insights that were always casual but sharp. Miss Marple, who had known Emily for decades, sat nearby, sipping her tea with quiet composure. At first glance, no one would think Miss Marple was anything other than a frail old woman, slight of stature, with a wrinkled face and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. She had the air of someone who belonged to another era, and in a way she did. She had lived through enough of life's ups and downs to develop an understanding of human nature far deeper than most, and it was her keen observations that made her more astute than any detective in London. Her unassuming nature made it easy for people to underestimate her, a mistake most came to regret. The conversation had started off as it always did at these gatherings, casual, polite, and aimed mostly at keeping things light. The local weather, the best plants for the garden, and the newest additions to the village were the typical topics. Mrs. Stroud kept moving from group to group, her voice rising above the chatter like the conductor of an orchestra, ensuring that no one was left out of the social rhythm. Well, I do say, Mrs. Stroud's voice cut through the air. Has anyone received that letter from the solicitor regarding the land dispute at Oakley Farm? I was told it was being sent out to everyone. Her question caused a noticeable stir among the guests. The mention of Oakley Farm was enough to draw attention, for it had been the subject of village gossip for weeks. Rupert Harrow, the late owner, had left a considerable estate, and his death had left the property in legal limbo. There had been talk of a dispute over the farm's inheritance, and now a letter from the solicitor, Mr. Philip Turner, The village solicitor was supposed to clarify matters, but it seemed that the letter had not arrived as expected. "I haven't received anything," replied Miss Emily Cartwright in her soft, matter-of-fact tone, her spectacles glinting in the sunlight. "Not a thing, dear. Not even a whisper from the solicitor's office. It is quite strange, isn't it?" The others murmured in agreement, sharing similar tales of missing correspondence. One by one, they each mentioned how they hadn't received their letters, a quiet ripple of unease spreading through the group. Miss Marple, however, noticed something more than the mere inconvenience of the missing letters. As she sipped her tea, her gaze lingered on Mrs. Stroud, whose lips were slightly pursed, her eyes darting from one guest to the next. It was a fleeting moment, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that people often gave away more in a moment of distraction than in hours of conversation. "I thought it was odd," Mrs. Stroud continued, her voice a little higher than usual, "that they would send the letters so late. The whole matter with Mr. Harrow's will has been dragging on for quite some time now." As the conversation shifted to the details of Oakley Farm's inheritance, Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes scanning the group. It was then that she noticed Mr. Philip Turner, the solicitor, standing in the corner of the garden. He was engaged in a quiet conversation with Mrs. Rebecca Langley, a woman of about 50 with a composed demeanour and a subtle, mysterious air. Miss Langley had been a widow for many years, and was known for her discretion and sharp intelligence. She had recently become involved in the dispute over Oakley Farm, her name having been mentioned more than once in connection with the will. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the way their conversation unfolded. Both Mr. Turner and Mrs. Langley were speaking in hushed tones, their heads slightly inclined towards each other, as though sharing a secret. Miss Marple had seen this before. People were often careful in their words when there was something they didn't want others to overhear. She had witnessed such subtle exchanges in her long years of observing human nature. The conversation was so quiet that Miss Marple could only catch a few words. Mr. Harrow, the letter, and a matter of urgency. But it was the nervous glance that Mr. Turner shot around the garden, as if checking to see who might be watching, that caused Miss Marple's curiosity to spike. She had seen that look before in her own life, a glance of guilt, of someone who was hiding something, and she knew it was not just a coincidence that the solicitor was speaking with Mrs. Langley at that precise moment. As the guests began to settle down again, the conversation shifting back to the lighter topics of the day, Miss Marple stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She had learned long ago that the best way to uncover the truth was to allow people to reveal themselves, to let them forget the presence of an observant outsider like herself. She made her way across the garden, her footsteps soft on the gravel, as she headed towards the tea table. It was then, just as she was about to take a sip of her tea, that a sharp, high-pitched scream echoed through the garden. The sound was so sudden and jarring that it took a moment for the guests to comprehend what had happened. Some of them stood frozen in place, while others rushed toward the gate where the scream had come from. The source of the commotion was not immediately apparent, but Miss Marple, ever calm, moved without hesitation, her mind already beginning to piece together the possibilities. The scream came again, this time followed by hurried footsteps as several guests bolted towards the gate. Miss Marple, too, moved with purpose, her thoughts racing as she approached the source of the disturbance. It was only when she reached the garden gate that she saw the cause of the outcry. A single letter, fluttering in the breeze, pinned to the gate-post by a small silver brooch. The letter was elegant, with a thick cream-coloured envelope, sealed with a wax emblem that had been carefully pressed. It bore no address, no return information, but the handwriting was unmistakable to anyone familiar with it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her intuition telling her that this letter was far more significant than anyone realized. It had been placed with a deliberate air of finality, as though the sender wanted to make a statement. Mrs. Stroud, now flustered, stepped forward. "But what is this? Who has done this?" she demanded, her voice rising in indignation. The others stood around her, looking as puzzled as they were concerned. But Miss Marple remained still, allowing the others to gather around, their curiosity growing with each passing second. She noticed that Mr. Turner, too, had arrived at the scene, his face pale and his eyes darting about nervously. It was then that she knew this letter was no ordinary correspondence. It was a harbinger of something much darker, something that had been set in motion long before today's gathering. As the guests stood in silent confusion, Miss Marple took one last glance at the letter, her mind working to connect the dots. She didn't need to speak just yet. She knew the answers were already beginning to reveal themselves, hidden in plain sight, and soon she would uncover the truth. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The garden was filled with murmurs. The guests crowded around the gate as the letter, now taken from its place and passed between hands, became the centre of attention. Miss Marple, as ever, observed quietly from the sidelines, though her mind was already at work. It wasn't the letter itself that had caught her interest. It was the way the villagers were reacting to it. The panic, the gossip, the speculation. All of it felt too theatrical for a mere piece of correspondence. The letter had been placed there deliberately. That much was clear. But why? And why now? Who could have left this letter? Mrs. Stroud's voice was high-pitched with frustration as she clutched the envelope in her hands, the wax seal broken, but the contents still concealed. "This is nothing but nonsense. Someone must be playing tricks on us." "I don't believe that's the case," said Emily Cartwright, her voice calm but laced with a hint of concern. She adjusted her spectacles and leaned in, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. "There's something about this letter, something more to it than meets the eye." Emily had always been one for speculation, and her quiet observations often held more weight than people gave them credit for. But even Miss Marple, with all her years of experience in human nature, had to admit that this letter felt different. The way it had been placed so deliberately, the secrecy behind its delivery. It wasn't just about the land dispute anymore. "I'll take it to Mr. Turner," said Mrs. Stroud, her tone now more businesslike. She was, after all, the one who had invited the solicitor to the party in the first place. If anyone could get answers, it would be her. But as Mrs. Stroud turned to leave the garden, Miss Marple made a slight motion to stop her. "Not just yet, Violet," she said, her voice soft yet authoritative. "It's not wise to rush to conclusions. Let's allow everyone a moment to consider what we're dealing with before we act." Mrs. Stroud blinked, taken aback by the suggestion. "You think there's something more to this?" she asked, her tone sceptical. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "It's always wise to let the dust settle before we pick up the pieces. Let's wait." The group stood in an uneasy silence, each person's mind working overtime as they tried to make sense of the situation. It wasn't long before the whispers began, subtle at first, but gradually rising in volume, as more and more guests began to form their own theories. "I heard rumours that Mr. Harrow's will wasn't quite as straightforward as it seemed." Mrs. Langley's voice floated over from the other side of the garden, her tone sharp but measured. She was, after all, a woman who had learned to keep her emotions in check. Perhaps someone didn't want the truth about his estate to come to light. Her words were like a spark in dry grass, igniting a firestorm of speculation. "What? Truth?" Mrs. Stroud demanded, her voice now tinged with more than just annoyance. "I've heard all this before, Rebecca. The gossip, the innuendo. But what truth are you talking about?" Rebecca Langley's lips curled into a thin smile, though her eyes remained hard and unreadable. "Oh, Violet, you know as well as I do that there are things in Mr. Harrow's past that might not sit well with the village. His dealings with certain people. Let's just say that not everything was as it seemed." "Perhaps you'd care to elaborate?" Miss Cartwright asked, her voice soft but laced with a subtle challenge. Emily, though often mild in demeanour, had a sharp mind beneath her quiet exterior. But Rebecca simply shook her head, her smile disappearing. "Not here, not now, but I'm sure we'll all find out in due time." Miss Marple, still standing at the edge of the group, observed the conversation with interest. Rebecca Langley had a knack for dropping cryptic statements like that, all the while hiding behind an air of aloofness. It wasn't that Miss Marple didn't trust her. She had known Rebecca for years, and had always found her to be a woman of mystery, but a woman who was never far from suspicion. Her words, though carefully chosen, were designed to stir the pot, and stir it they did. As the partygoers continued to speculate, some leaning toward the idea of a simple prank, others muttering about family secrets, Miss Marple remained a quiet observer. She was particularly aware of one thing. Mr. Turner had not said a word since the letter had arrived. He stood near the edge of the garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. It was clear to Miss Marple that he was not just a passive observer, but rather someone who knew more than he was letting on. And in the midst of this unfolding drama, he had become a silent, almost invisible player in the game. Miss Marple allowed a few moments of quiet observation to pass, before she finally moved toward Mr. Turner, her footsteps soft on the gravel. She didn't approach him immediately. There was no rush. Instead, she took the long way around the garden, casually weaving through the guests, giving them each a polite nod or smile, as she made her way to the back of the house where Mr. Turner was standing. "Mr. Turner," Miss Marple greeted him with a faint smile as she approached. "It seems there's some excitement in the air today." The solicitor turned, his expression tightening for a brief moment before he forced a smile. "Miss Marple," he replied, his tone neutral. "Yes, indeed. It's certainly unexpected." "You seem troubled," Miss Marple observed gently, her voice soft but keen. "Perhaps a bit more than the rest of the group." Mr. Turner hesitated before speaking again, his gaze flicking nervously toward the others, before returning to Miss Marple. "I've had a few personal matters to attend to today, and this letter, it's complicated." Miss Marple studied him closely, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Complicated, you say? I'm sure you're used to handling legal matters, though. This doesn't seem like something that should trouble you so." He gave a thin, tight smile, but didn't answer her directly. "It's not the letter itself," he said, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear, "but rather what it signifies." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the words. "Ah, yes. The contents of a letter are often less important than the timing of its arrival. It's the context that matters, don't you think?" Mr. Turner's expression flickered, just for a moment, and in that moment Miss Marple knew that he was hiding something. She didn't need any more confirmation. The letter, the secrecy, and the timing were all too deliberate, too calculated to be coincidental. "Well, Mr. Turner, I'll let you return to your business," Miss Marple said with a soft chuckle, her eyes twinkling as she took a step back. "But do remember, I do so enjoy a good puzzle." Turning away, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had no solid evidence yet, no proof to present. But there was a pattern forming, and it was one she had seen before. A carefully orchestrated game was underway, and it was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The garden party carried on, though the atmosphere had shifted from the usual carefree chatter to something more tense, as if everyone was waiting for the next chapter of this unexpected drama to unfold. As the guests mingled and exchanged polite pleasantries, Miss Marple took a quiet leave from the crowd. She had learned long ago that the best way to observe a mystery was from the sidelines, allowing others to speak freely, unaware of her close attention. She made her way slowly down the winding path toward the old oak tree at the far end of the garden, a favourite spot of hers for quiet contemplation. Here she could sit undisturbed, her mind carefully sifting through the events of the day. Miss Marple knew from experience that sometimes the most crucial clue was the one that seemed the least important at first glance. As she settled herself on a nearby bench, the sound of voices gradually faded behind her, leaving her in a moment of relative peace. The only sounds now were the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the guests discussing the letter. Though she was outwardly calm, her mind was anything but still. The letter had caused a stir, and the more Miss Marple reflected on it, the more she was convinced that it was central to this strange turn of events. It had arrived too conveniently, in the middle of a delicate situation with Mr. Harrow's will, just as the tensions between the villagers were beginning to boil over. The timing was deliberate. "I must remember that nothing is as it seems," Miss Marple murmured softly to herself. Her musings were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps approaching her from behind. Miss Marple turned to find Emily Cartwright, the mild-mannered but astute local schoolteacher, standing at a respectful distance, her expression thoughtful. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," Emily said, her voice betraying a mix of curiosity and concern. "But I couldn't help but notice how unsettled things have become." Miss Marple smiled and patted the seat beside her. "Not at all, my dear. Please come sit. We can all use a bit of peace after the storm." Emily seated herself slowly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It's all so strange, don't you think? A letter that arrives out of nowhere, and suddenly everything seems to be turned upside down. I've never seen Violet quite so rattled before." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it's quite unlike her to be so flustered. But there's something more to this than a mere letter. I don't believe it's the piece of paper that has the power to disturb the peace here. It's what it represents, what it might be, hiding." Emily's brow furrowed slightly. "You think it's connected to something deeper? To the arguments about Mr. Harrow's will?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Oh, yes. It's too convenient, isn't it? The timing of this letter, the emotions it's stirring up, it all points to something carefully orchestrated." Emily was quiet for a moment, considering Miss Marple's words. "You think someone is manipulating the situation?" "I do," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone is pulling the strings, but they're being clever enough to remain unseen. That's what makes this mystery so intriguing." Emily's gaze shifted toward the house, where the others were gathered, still discussing the letter in hushed voices. "But who? And why?" Miss Marple let out a soft sigh, her mind still working through the puzzle. "That's the question, my dear. That's always the question, isn't it? Who benefits from all of this confusion? Who stands to gain from the chaos and the uncertainty?" The two women sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. Miss Marple was already considering her next steps. She couldn't just sit and wait for the mystery to reveal itself. She had to take action, quietly, unobtrusively, as she always did. "Would you like to do a bit of investigating, Emily?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but purposeful. Emily blinked, clearly taken aback. "Investigating? But what could I possibly do? I'm not—" "Oh, it's quite simple, really," Miss Marple interrupted with a smile. "You see, my dear, the first thing we must do is pay attention to the small things, the things that no one else seems to notice. And that's where you come in." Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued now. "I'm listening." "I want you to keep an eye on Mr. Turner," Miss Marple said quietly. "He's been rather reserved today, don't you think?" Emily nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, I did notice that. He's been standing off to the side, barely interacting with anyone. It's not like him." "No, it's not," Miss Marple agreed. "And that's why I'm asking you to observe him carefully. Notice his behavior, his reactions, and most importantly, what he's not saying. There's something he's not telling us." "But why Mr. Turner?" Emily asked. "Surely he's the least likely person to be involved in something like this." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "It's often the ones we least suspect who are hiding the most. Mr. Turner is involved in this, Emily. He knows something, and I'm certain he's been keeping it to himself." Emily nodded slowly, clearly deep in thought. "I'll do my best. But what about the others? Mrs. Stroud seems particularly agitated, and there's something about Mrs. Langley. I'm not sure I trust her either." Miss Marple smiled again, her eyes sparkling with quiet amusement. "I wouldn't be too quick to judge, Emily. Everyone has their own secrets, even the most seemingly straightforward of people. We'll get to them in time." They sat in silence again for a while, watching as the other guests continued their discussions, unaware of the quiet alliance forming between the two women. Miss Marple was already formulating her next steps, her mind constantly turning over, possibilities, examining every nuance of behaviour and every small detail that others would overlook. Emily stood up after a while, her face set with determination. "I'll keep an eye on Mr. Turner, then. But I still don't understand why you think he's involved." Miss Marple's smile deepened, but there was no malice in it, only a knowing calm. "Ah, my dear, it's not about why he's involved, but when he became involved, and that, I'm afraid, is something we're still figuring out." As Emily walked back toward the party, Miss Marple leaned back against the bench, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was something deeply satisfying about solving a mystery, and though the pieces of this puzzle were still scattered, Miss Marple was confident that she was on the right track. She would wait for the clues to reveal themselves, and when they did, she would be ready. Chapter 4. The Web of Deceit. The garden had grown quieter as the evening wore on, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the well-kept lawns. The guests had moved inside the house, drawn by the promise of dinner, but Miss Marple remained outside, contemplating the various threads of the mystery. The cool evening air did little to calm her thoughts, which were as sharp as ever. She had already put her mind to work on Mr. Turner. His odd behaviour was enough to raise suspicion, but it was the small things, the subtle details, that made her believe he was more involved than he let on. His aloofness, the way he kept himself separate from the others, especially during moments of heightened emotion, wasn't typical of a man who had nothing to hide. Miss Marple suspected that his knowledge of the letter's contents might not be as incidental as he had tried to make it seem. As she sat on the stone bench, lost in thought, Emily Cartwright reappeared, her movements quiet but purposeful. Miss Marple looked up, her sharp eyes catching the young woman's every gesture. "I've been keeping my distance, as you suggested," Emily said, taking a seat beside Miss Marple. Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple noticed a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "There's something off about Mr. Turner, all right. I followed him after dinner when he went to his study. I didn't want to be too obvious, so I stayed at the end of the hall. But I saw him talking to someone in private." "Who?" Miss Marple asked, leaning in slightly, her curiosity piqued. Emily hesitated, as if trying to piece together what she had witnessed. It was hard to hear clearly, but it wasn't a friendly conversation. The man with him, he wasn't anyone I recognized, seemed to be warning Mr. Turner about something. And then, well, it was strange. I'm not sure, but I think they were talking about the will. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The will? Interesting. Did you hear anything specific?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. It was too muffled, but when Mr. Turner saw me, he immediately stopped talking. And the other man, he slipped out the back door. It was all very suspicious." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, processing the information. A man involved in something clandestine, possibly related to Mr. Harrow's will, meeting with someone in secret. This was a lead, no doubt about it, but she needed more to confirm her suspicions. "Well done, Emily," Miss Marple said softly, her voice warm with approval. "You've uncovered something important. Now we must be careful. If Mr. Turner is hiding something, we can't let him know we're on to him just yet. We must learn more about his visitor." Emily looked troubled, her brow furrowed. "But what if he's dangerous? What if we're making a mistake?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with the confidence of someone who had seen much more than Emily could imagine. "My dear, people are seldom as dangerous as they seem. They are far more likely to reveal their true nature when they feel they are in control. Let's continue to observe, quietly. We're getting closer." The two women sat in silence for a while, contemplating the next step. The evening had grown colder, and the sounds of the gathering inside the house echoed faintly in the distance. Miss Marple's mind was already calculating her next move. Back inside, the dinner party had taken on a quieter tone. The guests were no longer speaking in hushed tones about the letter, but their glances toward Violet Harrow were frequent, their expressions tight with curiosity. She had retreated to the corner of the room, sitting in near solitude, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a glass of wine. Miss Marple made her way into the room unnoticed, her eyes scanning the group. She knew that most of the people in this room were concealing something, but the question was, what were they hiding? As she moved toward the group, she overheard snippets of conversation, talk of Mr. Harrow's death, the family dynamics, and the speculations regarding the contents of the will. No one seemed to know much, but each person seemed eager to be the first to get their hands on the truth. It was clear that this was a game, and in games like these, it was always the quiet ones who had the most to lose. Miss Marple paused near Violet, who gave her a fleeting glance before quickly looking away. The woman was trying to appear composed, but there was a noticeable tightness in her posture, as if she were on the verge of breaking. "Violet," Miss Marple said softly, her voice just loud enough to be heard. "I understand this is a difficult time for you, but I hope you realize that the truth always has a way of coming to light. You can't hide it forever." Violet flinched, her eyes widening slightly before she recovered, offering a forced smile. "I'm not hiding anything, Miss Marple. It's just so much to process." Miss Marple studied her carefully, her keen gaze assessing every nuance of Violet's body language. She was lying, but it wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone skilled in the art of deception. The lady's efforts to maintain a calm facade were admirable, but there was a crack in her veneer. Miss Marple knew that Violet was afraid of something beyond just the letter. Before she could say anything more, Mr. Turner entered the room, his face more strained than before. He glanced briefly at Violet, then at Miss Marple, and quickly moved to join a group of men at the far side of the room. Violet's eyes followed him, and for a brief moment Miss Marple could see a flash of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt, pass across her face. Miss Marple's mind raced. What was the connection between Violet and Mr. Turner? Had their paths crossed before in a way that neither would openly admit? There was a hidden link between them. She was certain of it, but whether it was one of betrayal, blackmail, or something far more sinister, she couldn't yet tell. As the evening stretched on, Miss Marple continued to observe, silently noting the subtle interactions between the guests. She would need to confront them all eventually, but for now, patience was her ally. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was just around the corner. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following day dawned bright and crisp, with the kind of clear skies that made everything seem deceptively peaceful. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from at ease. The events of the previous night still buzzed in her, thoughts like a persistent fly. the clues she'd gathered flickering like the distant lights of a house on a darkened hill. She knew they were there, just out of her reach. But the full picture had yet to emerge. The village seemed unchanged, locked in its regular rhythms, as though nothing had happened the night before. The baker was sweeping the front steps. Postman was delivering letters, and the chatter from the village green could still be heard faintly from Miss Marple's cottage. But as she made her way to the Harrow estate later that morning, she felt the weight of the mystery growing heavier. With each step, she had decided to pay another visit to the scene of the crime, hoping to glean something that had been missed by others. In her experience, the first place a detective should look was not the obvious scene of the crime, but the periphery, the seemingly insignificant corners where truth often hid. As she approached the grand house, she was greeted by the butler, the same stiff and formal man who had ushered the guests into the house the evening before. His face was pale, and his eyes were downcast. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I trust you had a restful night." "Quite," Miss Marple replied, her smile polite but observant. "I trust you've had an interesting morning yourself." The butler hesitated, his gaze flickering momentarily toward the hallway behind him, before returning to Miss Marple. "The family is still adjusting. Miss Violet is in her study, and Mr. Turner is in the library. I believe it's the best time for you to speak with them, should you wish." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, her voice light but carrying an undertone of sharpness. "I'll go and have a word with Miss Violet, then." The butler stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to enter. She walked with deliberate slowness, taking in the quiet grandeur of the Harrow estate. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow her with their eyes, and the thick curtains, drawn tight against the morning light, gave the house an air of oppressive silence. Miss Marple found Violet sitting at her desk, papers scattered around her, as if she had been poring over them for hours. She looked up sharply when Miss Marple entered, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a little too steady, as though trying to maintain control over a situation that was slipping from her grasp. "I wasn't expecting you." "I apologize for the intrusion, Violet," Miss Marple said, taking a seat across from her. "But there are still many questions that need answers. Perhaps you can help me with one or two." Violet's lips tightened, but she nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the desk. "I'll do what I can, Miss Marple, but I've already told the police everything I know." "I understand," Miss Marple replied, "but sometimes even the smallest detail can reveal a great deal. For instance, I've been thinking about Mr. Harrow's letter, the one that never arrived, as it were." Violet's eyes flickered with a brief spark of alarm, quickly masked by a carefully practiced look of indifference. "I told the police that it was just a misunderstanding. There was no reason to think the letter was of any significance." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though it never lost its edge. "A misunderstanding, perhaps. But you see, Violet, in my experience, the significance of a thing is often determined not by what it is, but by what others believe it to be." Violet's gaze dropped to her hands, which were twisting in her lap. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly, though the edge of her voice betrayed a growing unease. Miss Marple smiled gently, her expression one of patient understanding. "I believe that there is something more you're not telling me. Violet, you've been very careful in your words, very controlled. It's as if you're trying to hide something, or perhaps someone." Violet's eyes shot up, her expression one of barely contained panic. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the door to the study swung open with a sudden force, startling both women. Mr. Turner stood in the doorway, his face drawn tight with an expression that could have been worry or anger, or both. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice clipped. Violet shot to her feet, her composure wavering for the first time. "Of course, everything's fine, Charles," she said, her voice a little too bright. I was just explaining things to Miss Marple. You know, the letter and everything." Mr. Turner's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, his eyes cold but calculating. "I see," he said, his voice suddenly becoming more measured. Perhaps it would be best if Miss Marple continued her inquiries elsewhere. "This is a private matter." Miss Marple stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I think, Mr. Turner, that there's no such thing as a truly private matter when a life is lost. It's not only the contents of the letter that we need to understand, but the people who are connected to it." Mr. Turner's eyes narrowed, but he did not respond. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple to pass him and leave the study. As she did, she couldn't help but notice the faintest crease of his brow, the tension in his shoulders, the way he subtly shifted his weight as if trying to mask something beneath the surface. The door clicked shut behind her, and Miss Marple felt a ripple of unease move through the air. Violet was hiding something, and Mr. Turner was more than just a man involved in the estate's affairs. He was entangled in a web of deceit, one that Miss Marple was beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself back in the garden, walking slowly along the gravel path, with Emily Cartwright by her side. They spoke little, but Miss Marple's mind was working tirelessly, sifting through the information she had gathered. The letter, the suspicious meetings, the odd behaviour of Violet and Mr. Turner. There was a pattern emerging, though it was still faint and incomplete. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that when the pieces didn't seem to fit, it was often because the picture was not what one expected. "Miss Marple, do you think Mr. Turner is guilty?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Miss Marple glanced at her, her face thoughtful. "I believe Mr. Turner knows more than he's letting on, but that does not make him guilty of murder. However, guilt is a tricky thing, my dear. Sometimes it's not the one who seems the most obvious who is the perpetrator, but the one who has the most to hide." As they walked together, Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the quiet garden, her mind already far ahead, envisioning the next steps in the case. She could feel the tension growing, the discovery of something, someone, soon to be revealed. But for now, she would wait, as always, for the right moment. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The days passed slowly, each one feeling like a subtle tightening of the noose around the village's once peaceful exterior. Despite the calm that seemed to pervade the Harrow estate, the atmosphere in the village grew heavier with each passing moment. Miss Marple, though outwardly composed, could sense the quiet shift in the air, as though something large and menacing were lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary life. The villagers continued with their routines, but she could feel the undercurrent of unease growing stronger. Everyone was watching everyone else now, no longer trusting the innocence they had once assumed about each other. It was early one morning, the sun still low in the sky, when Miss Marple received a summons from Violet Harrow. It was an unexpected request. The tension between the two women had been palpable since their last conversation, and Miss Marple had fully expected Violet to retreat further into her world of polite evasions and half-truths. But something had changed. Miss Marple could sense it. Violet had become desperate. Desperation made people dangerous. When Miss Marple arrived at the Harrow estate, the butler met her with the same air of stiff formality, though his face was creased with the faintest sign of anxiety. He escorted her upstairs to Violet's study, where she was waiting, looking more drawn than ever before. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her, her eyes wide and restless. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice tremulous but steady. "I've been thinking. Perhaps there is more to this than I initially thought, more that I need to tell you." Miss Marple took a seat in the chair opposite Violet, studying her with that calm, piercing gaze that seemed to look past the surface and straight to the heart of things. "I'm glad you've reconsidered, Violet," she said softly. "There are many things we still don't know." Violet looked up at her, her eyes darting briefly to the door, as though she feared someone might be listening. "There are things I never wanted to say, not to anyone," she whispered, "but I think you deserve to know the truth." Miss Marple nodded without speaking, giving Violet the space to continue. The silence stretched for a long moment, and just as Miss Marple thought she might be losing her nerve, Violet took a deep breath and began to speak. "It was Mr. Turner," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He knew about the letter. He knew about everything." Miss Marple did not react immediately. She let the silence settle between them, her mind ticking through the possibilities. "Mr. Turner," she repeated softly. "And what exactly does Mr. Turner know, Violet?" Violet's face twisted in distress, and her voice faltered. "He knew about the affair, the one I had with my husband's brother." She choked on the words, as though even now the shame of it weighed heavy on her chest. "It was years ago, before Edward and I were married. But it's something I've never been able to escape. I thought I could bury it, forget about it, but when the letter went missing, I realized I couldn't hide it anymore." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Violet's face. "You are saying that Mr. Turner knew about this affair? How?" Violet nodded, her lips trembling. "Edward's brother Harold, he died shortly after we were married. But before he died, he wrote a letter. He said that he knew what had happened between us, and that he would expose me if I ever betrayed Edward. The letter, it was in my husband's study, hidden in a drawer that no one ever looked in. But when Harold died, we thought everything was over. But now, with the letter missing, I think it's all coming back to haunt me." Miss Marple's mind raced. She knew the villagers were full of secrets, each one more layered than the last. But this was a revelation that tied everything together in a new, unexpected way. Mr. Turner's involvement was no longer a casual one. He had known about Violet's affair, and now he was somehow tied to the letter's disappearance. But why? What had Harold's death and the letter really meant? "Have you spoken to Mr. Turner about this?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low. Violet looked away, her eyes dark with something close to fear. "No, I haven't. I'm too afraid. He might use it against me. He could tell Edward everything. I can't let that happen. Edward can't know the truth." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "And Edward, does he suspect anything?" Violet's lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't think so. But if Mr. Turner tells him, I don't know what Edward would do. I don't know what any of us would do." Miss Marple let the conversation hang in the air for a moment, considering what she had learned. She could sense there was more to the story. There always was in these cases. But it was becoming increasingly clear that Mr. Turner had a significant role to play in this web of deceit. And Violet, despite her protestations, was at the centre of it all. "Thank you, Violet," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady and calm. "You've been very brave in sharing this with me." Violet nodded, looking both relieved and exhausted. "I don't know what to do any more. I thought I could keep everything buried, but now I'm afraid that everything is falling apart." Miss Marple stood up, her expression thoughtful. "You've done the right thing by telling me. I'll find out what happened to the letter, and perhaps more." As she turned to leave, Violet's voice called out to her, desperate. "Miss Marple, please, whatever you do, don't let Edward find out about Harold, please." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked back over her shoulder, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "I will do what I must, Violet, but I will also find the truth, no matter how difficult it may be." As Miss Marple left the study, she felt a strange unease settle in her chest. She had learned much, yes, but she also knew that this was just the beginning of a much darker story. Violet's confession had peeled back a layer of the mystery, but there were still far too many unanswered questions. Why had Mr. Turner been so invested in the letter's disappearance? What was his true connection to the death of Harold Harrow? And most importantly, who stood to gain the most from these buried secrets coming to light? The pieces of the puzzle were shifting in Miss Marple's mind, falling into place one by one, but she knew that the final image would not be clear until she had dug deeper, until she had confronted each of the suspects and pressed them until they revealed their true selves. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her thoughts swirling with the revelations of the day. She passed the familiar cottages, their gardens in full bloom, the sounds of children playing echoing in the distance. But all of it felt like a veneer now, a thin layer of normalcy over something darker. As she approached the village green, she saw Emily Cartwright sitting on one of the benches, her head bowed, her expression distant. Miss Marple took a seat beside her, studying her with quiet curiosity. "You seem troubled, Emily," she said gently. "What's on your mind?" Emily looked up, her eyes clouded with concern. "Miss Marple, I don't know what to make of all this. There's something about Mr. Turner. He's been acting so strangely, and I don't know if I can trust him." Miss Marple studied her carefully, her mind already working. "Tell me more about Mr. Turner. What makes you doubt him?" Emily's gaze flickered, her voice lowering. "I've seen him around the estate at odd times, late at night, when no one else is around. And once I saw him arguing with Harold. Before Harold died, I don't know what it was about, but it looked serious." Miss Marple's heart quickened at the mention of Harold. "Tell me more, Emily," she said, her voice steady. Emily hesitated, her brow furrowed. "I don't know exactly, but there was something in Mr. Turner's face that night. Something cold, like he was afraid of Harold, or maybe even angry. It was unsettling." Miss Marple's mind raced as she took in Emily's words. The pieces were coming together more quickly now, faster than she could have anticipated. The picture was clearer, but it was still incomplete. She had to press on, to follow every lead, to leave no stone unturned. "Thank you, Emily," Miss Marple said softly. "You've been very helpful." Emily nodded, her face still marked by unease. "I just hope you can find out the truth, Miss Marple. I don't think any of us can live with the secrets much longer." Miss Marple stood, her gaze focused on the horizon, the quiet village still so unaware of the storm brewing just beneath its surface. "I will, Emily," she said quietly. "I will." Chapter 7. Another twist. The days following Miss Marple's conversation with Emily Cartwright passed in a blur of unease. The village, once a picture of idyllic tranquillity, now felt like a place bracing for an inevitable storm. Even the most mundane events carried an undercurrent of tension. The sound of footsteps echoing down narrow lanes seemed louder. The chatter in the village pub more hurried, the smiles of the villagers more strained. It was as though everyone had become aware of the dark cloud hanging overhead, yet no one dared speak of it openly. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, took it all in, the subtle shifts in behaviour, the way the villagers exchanged furtive glances, the hesitation in their voices. All of it spoke to something larger, something far more dangerous than a simple missing letter or a forgotten affair. The pieces were almost there, but one piece was still conspicuously absent, and then, just as she was beginning to feel the weight of her deductions, an unexpected turn of events forced the investigation into new and unfamiliar territory. It began with the discovery of another body. The body was found late one evening, just as the village was settling into its usual rhythm of dimming streetlights and muted conversation. It was Henry Turner, the village's reclusive historian and one of Miss Marple's more reluctant acquaintances. He was discovered in his study, slumped over his desk, an expression of shock frozen on his face. The scene was eerily similar to the one that had occurred with Harold Harrow. But this time there was no letter, no clue, nothing to explain the cause of death. The news sent ripples of shock through the village, and before long, the investigation had expanded to include both the mysterious death of Harold Harrow and now Henry Turner. As the villagers gathered in the square to discuss the two deaths, a grim realization began to form. Something much larger was at play than anyone had anticipated. Miss Marple, of course, did not rush to conclusions. She remained calm and thoughtful, a quiet observer as the police led their investigation. The constable, still new to the village, seemed flustered by the sudden turn of events. He had been expecting a quick resolution to Harold's death, but now it seemed as though they were caught in the grip of something far more sinister. The police questioned Violet Harrow first. After all, she had been the last person seen with Henry Turner, though no one could recall any specifics about their meeting. Violet was, as always, composed, perhaps even too composed in Miss Marple's estimation. There was something about her calmness that felt artificial, as though she were hiding something, though she had nothing to gain from Henry's death. Still, Miss Marple couldn't shake the nagging thought that Violet knew more than she was letting on. The investigation took a new turn when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Edward Harrow himself. "Miss Marple," Edward said, his voice uncharacteristically tense, "I need your help. I don't know who else to turn to." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the strain in his posture, the way his eyes darted nervously around the room. It was clear that he was not the same man she had met just days ago. His usual air of confidence had been replaced by something darker, something brittle. "Of course, Edward," she said, her tone soothing. "What is it that troubles you?" Edward hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "It's my brother's death," he began. "I know the police are investigating, but I don't trust them to see things clearly. Harold's death was not an accident. I'm certain of it. And now with Henry Turner, there's something wrong, Miss Marple. Something we've all missed." Miss Marple's curiosity piqued. "What makes you think that, Edward?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in intensity. "It's the letter. The letter that Harold wrote before his death. I believe Turner had it, and I believe it's no coincidence that Turner is dead now, too." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind racing with possibilities. The letter. Of course, it had to be connected somehow. But how? And why had it been so important that two men had to die over it? "You've made an interesting observation," Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "But I must ask, what exactly was in this letter, Edward? What could be so dangerous that it would lead to Harold's death, and now Henry's?" Edward's expression faltered for a moment, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, before he regained control. "I don't know," he said, tightly. "But I've heard rumours. People have said it contained information that could ruin lives. And I believe Turner knew about it. He knew the truth, and that's why he's dead now." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, carefully considering Edward's words. There was a dangerous undercurrent to his confession, something he wasn't telling her, something he was holding back. She could sense it in the way his eyes avoided hers, the way his hands clenched in his lap. But he had provided a crucial piece of information, the letter. If she could find it, perhaps everything would fall into place. "Thank you, Edward," Miss Marple said softly. "I will do my best to uncover the truth, as I always do. But you must be careful. Secrets have a way of unravelling when you least expect them." Edward nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I will, Miss Marple, I promise." As he left, Miss Marple sat in silence, her thoughts spinning. The letter. It was the key to everything, she was certain of it. But where was it now? Who had taken it? And, most importantly, who had killed Harold and Henry to keep its contents hidden? Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the Harrow estate once more. She had questions that needed answers, and she had a growing suspicion that the missing letter could be the thread that tied everything together. The estate was quiet when she arrived. The staff had all been sent home, and the house seemed to breathe with an eerie stillness. Violet was in her study, as Miss Marple had expected, looking every bit the portrait of grace and dignity. Yet her eyes betrayed a deep unease. "Miss Marple," Violet said when she entered, her voice soft but strained. "I knew you would come. I suppose you have more questions." Miss Marple sat across from her, her expression calm but unwavering. "I do, Violet, and I think it's time you told me everything. The letter, Violet. Where is it?" Violet's face paled, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, too quickly. "There's no letter." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady on her. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Edward has already told me about it. Now, it's time for you to be honest with me, Violet. Where is the letter?" Violet swallowed hard, her composure cracking for the briefest of moments. I don't have it," she whispered. "But I know who does." Miss Marple's heart quickened with anticipation. This was it, the missing piece. "Who has it, Violet?" she pressed gently. Violet looked away, her face stricken. "Mr. Turner. He was the one who took it. He threatened to use it against me, against Edward, against us all. But now he's dead, and I don't know what to do." Miss Marple sat back, absorbing this new revelation. Henry Turner had taken the letter. But why had he kept it? What had it contained? And most importantly, who had killed Harold and Turner to prevent its contents from being revealed? The truth was becoming clearer now. Each new discovery only raised more questions, more possibilities. Miss Marple was closing in on the heart of the mystery, but she knew there was still one final confrontation left to face. Whoever was behind these deaths, whoever had taken the letter, would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And Miss Marple would not rest until those secrets were exposed. Chapter 8. The Unravelling Truth. The days following Violet's confession were a whirlwind of calculated observation and meticulous investigation for Miss Marple. As the village held its collective breath, the constable continued his fruitless search for answers, while Miss Marple quietly pieced together the intricate puzzle. There was an undeniable sense that they were nearing the moment when everything would finally make sense. But the web of lies and half-truths was so thick, she knew there was still more to uncover. The letter had become the focal point of the investigation, the proverbial smoking gun that had yet to be found. But what was contained within it? What had been so dangerous that it led to Harold's death, and now Turner's? Miss Marple couldn't shake the image of Violet Harrow, pale and anxious, telling her that Turner had been the one to take it. The question remained, why had Turner kept the letter for himself? And why had he been killed, if, as Violet implied, the secret had died with him? It was late one evening when Miss Marple received a surprising call from an unexpected source. Edward Harrow. His voice was shaky, almost desperate. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. It's about the letter." Miss Marple had never heard Edward sound so frantic, and she wasted no time in meeting him at his study. As she arrived, she was immediately struck by the dim light of the room, casting long shadows over Edward's haggard face. He was pacing, a glass of whisky trembling in his hand. "Edward, you look dreadful," Miss Marple said softly, taking a seat across from him. "What's going on?" He didn't answer immediately, taking a long drink from his glass before finally speaking. "It's about the letter, Miss Marple. I lied to you." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Edward looked up, his eyes haunted. "Turner wasn't the only one who knew about it. I knew. I've known for years. And now I'm afraid it's all coming to a head." Miss Marple's mind raced. Edward had known about the letter for years. What could be so dangerous that it involved both him and Turner in a secret so deeply buried? The implications were staggering. If there was a conspiracy, a cover-up, it had been going on much longer than anyone had realized. "Edward," Miss Marple said calmly, her voice steady as a rock, "tell me everything. The truth, no matter how difficult." Edward hesitated, then set the glass down, his hands shaking. "I didn't want to be involved, Miss Marple. I didn't want anyone to know. But Harold was going to expose everything. The letter, it was a confession of sorts. A confession of a terrible mistake." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What kind of mistake?" Edward took a deep breath, his gaze never meeting hers. "It was about my father. About something he did before, his death. Something that could ruin everything, the family, the estate, our reputation. Turner had evidence, and so did I. And Harold found out. He was going to use the letter to blackmail me, to force me into revealing it. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't. It would have destroyed everything." The room grew cold as Miss Marple absorbed his words. The revelation hit her like a thunderclap. Edward had been complicit in some dark family secret. The letter wasn't just about an affair or a crime of passion. It was about a legacy of guilt and shame that had been carefully hidden for decades. "But why kill Harold?" Miss Marple asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the letter was meant to be kept a secret, why didn't you just confront him?" Edward's face contorted in pain. "Because Harold wasn't the only one who knew, Miss Marple. Someone else had found out, and I feared they would come after me too. I didn't kill Harold, but I know who did." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. "Who?" Edward's eyes were wide, his expression one of pure terror. "Violet, my sister. She found out and she was furious. She threatened to expose everything. I think she was going to tell the police. She had to be stopped." It took everything in Miss Marple's power to keep her composure. Violet Harrow, Edward's own sister, had been the one to kill Harold. And now, it seemed, she was implicated in Turner's death as well. "Edward, you must understand," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "If Violet killed Harold and Turner, she has done so to protect a secret. And that secret, whatever it is, must be very dangerous. You need to tell me everything. The truth, Edward. The whole truth." Edward's face crumpled in despair. "It's too late. It's all too late. The truth will destroy us all." Miss Marple's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. Violet had killed Harold and Turner, that much was clear. But what was the secret that had driven her to such extremes? And who else was involved in this web of deceit? Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. The truth was within her grasp, but time was running out. The next day Miss Marple returned to the Harrow estate, determined to confront Violet once and for all. She was ready to face the truth, no matter how dark it might be. When she arrived at Violet's study, the atmosphere was tense. Violet was seated by the window, her face a mask of calm, but Miss Marple could sense the underlying panic that lay just beneath the surface. "I know everything, Violet," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "I know about the letter, about your father, and about what you've done to keep it all buried. But I'm here to give you a chance to tell the truth before it's too late." Violet stood up abruptly, her expression hardening. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I think I do," Miss Marple replied quietly. "You killed Harold, and you killed Henry Turner because they were going to expose a secret that you couldn't allow to come to light. A secret about your father." Violet's face turned pale, and for a moment she seemed to lose her composure. "You don't know anything," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I did what I had to do. They couldn't know the truth. It would destroy us all. I had no choice." Miss Marple's heart went out to her, but she didn't let her guard down. "What was the truth, Violet? What was your father hiding?" Violet's lips trembled. "It wasn't just him. It was us. My family. My father. He wasn't who you think. He was. And neither am I." And then the final piece clicked into place. The Harrow family wasn't just hiding a scandal. They were hiding a much darker truth, one that could shatter everything. And now Miss Marple was about to uncover it. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The morning mist had yet to lift as Miss Marple made her way to the Harrow estate, feeling a sense of quiet determination. The truth was finally within her reach, and she knew that this moment, this final conversation with Violet Harrow, would be the last step in unearthing the tragic chain of events that had led to murder, deceit, and a secret too dangerous to be revealed. The weight of the mystery hung heavily in the air, and Miss Marple could feel the tension rising with every step she took toward Violet's study. Violet was still seated by the window when Miss Marple entered. Her eyes were puffy from the sleepless nights she had undoubtedly spent in turmoil. The harshness in her demeanour from the previous day had softened, though the desperation in her eyes remained unchanged. There was something in her posture, a tightness around her shoulders, that spoke volumes. Miss Marple seated herself across from Violet, maintaining a calm, composed presence. She had seen the patterns before, the emotional walls people built around themselves when confronted with the truth they could no longer hide. This was one such case, and Miss Marple knew that the cracks were beginning to show. "Violet," Miss Marple began gently, her voice soft but firm. "I know you have been hiding something that has driven you to terrible lengths. You murdered Harold and Turner to keep this secret buried. But now it is time to bring the truth to light. You don't have to carry this burden any longer." Violet's lips trembled slightly as she took a deep breath, her gaze shifting from Miss Marple's steady eyes to the ground beneath her feet. She seemed to struggle with herself, as though the confession was clawing its way to the surface. But she could not yet bear to speak the words. "I didn't want it to come to this," Violet said at last, her voice breaking. "I've been living with the shame for so long, but it was the only way to protect the family, to protect everything my father worked for. You don't understand what it was like. You have no idea the things we were forced to do." Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes never leaving Violet's face. She understood more than Violet realized, but now was not the time to reveal that she had already pieced the truth together. She waited, allowing the silence to grow heavy and thick with expectation. Finally, Violet's shoulders slumped, as though she could no longer bear the weight of her own guilt. "It wasn't my father who was the true villain," Violet began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was me. All this time I've been running from the truth, running from the consequences of my own actions. You see, I wasn't just hiding something about my father. I was hiding something about myself." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Violet had confessed to the murders, but she had yet to reveal the true nature of the secret she had been hiding. It was not just a familial scandal, a mere betrayal or wrongdoing. It was something much more damning, something that would ruin not only her, but the very foundation of the Harrow family's legacy. "I was in love with Harold," Violet continued, her eyes distant, haunted. "I know it sounds absurd, but it's the truth. He wasn't just my brother-in-law. He was the one person who made me feel alive, who made me feel like I mattered. My marriage to Edward, it was never enough for me. I thought Harold and I could be together. But when he found out about the letter, about the things I'd done, the things I was hiding, he threatened to expose everything. He was going to ruin me. He was going to ruin all of us." Miss Marple's breath caught in her chest as she listened to Violet's confession. The web of lies, jealousy, and desperation was finally unraveling. But this was only part of the story, the part that revealed the human emotions and motivations at the heart of the crime. What still remained to be uncovered was the darkness that had driven Violet to such extreme actions. "I had to stop him," Violet continued, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to, but I couldn't let him destroy everything. He was going to tell Edward. He was going to tell everyone about us. So I did what I had to do. I killed Harold to protect my secret. I killed Turner because he was starting to ask too many questions. He knew something was wrong, and I couldn't risk him telling anyone. And now you're here, Miss Marple, and I'm trapped. There's no way out." Miss Marple's heart ached as she listened to Violet's confession. The emotions were raw, a potent mix of love, guilt, and fear. But Miss Marple knew that there was still more to this mystery than what Violet had revealed. She had confessed to the murders, but there was something deeper at play here, something darker that had not yet been uncovered. "Violet," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent, "you have confessed to killing Harold and Turner to protect a secret. But what about your father? You said you were hiding something about him, something that could destroy the family. What was it?" Violet's eyes filled with tears, and she seemed to shrink inwardly, as if the very idea of speaking those words was too much to bear. She pressed her hands to her face, her body trembling with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "Your father, he wasn't just a respected man of the community," Violet whispered. "He was involved in illegal activities. He had connections with criminals, people who were involved in smuggling and corruption. And I was part of it. I helped him. I kept the secrets. The letter that Harold found was a record of all the illegal transactions, all the deals my father made with criminals. I had been hiding it for years, thinking that if I kept it buried, it would never come to light. But when Harold found out, when he started pushing, I knew everything was going to fall apart. And then Turner found out, and I couldn't let him ruin me too." The room fell silent as Miss Marple processed Violet's words. The truth was finally laid bare. Not only had Violet murdered to protect her secret love affair with Harold, but she had also been hiding her father's criminal activities, which, if exposed, would have destroyed everything. The murders of Harold and Turner were not merely the acts of a desperate woman trying to protect her reputation. They were the tragic culmination of a series of choices that had led Violet down a dark and treacherous path. Miss Marple stood, her expression one of quiet sadness. "Violet, the truth has been uncovered, but there are consequences. You can no longer hide from what you've done. The law will have to take its course." Violet's face crumpled and she fell to her knees. "I didn't want this, Miss Marple. I didn't want any of it, but I had no choice. What could I do? What could I have done?" Miss Marple looked down at Violet with a mix of sympathy and sorrow. "You always had a choice, Violet, but now you must face the consequences of the choices you made." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she paused at the door, casting one last look over her shoulder. The mystery had been solved, the truth had been uncovered, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally in place. But the cost had been high, and the quiet village of Marlow would never be the same again. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. The sun had risen higher by the time Miss Marple left the Harrow estate. The day was clear and crisp, the kind of morning that promised a fresh start. Yet, as Miss Marple walked through the village streets, there was a strange stillness in the air. It was as though the earth itself had paused, holding its breath. The peaceful rhythm of everyday life in Marlow had been forever altered. The quiet village, once a sanctuary for secrets and quiet scandals, was now marked by the shadows of truth. Miss Marple didn't mind the quiet. She had long since learned that the real drama of the world often played out in silence, behind closed doors, in the unsaid words, and the furtive glances between people who thought they were invisible. She had watched it all her life. Human nature, as complex and unpredictable as it was, always left clues. If you knew where to look and how to observe, the truth was never far behind. She walked to the village square, where the normal buzz of the morning market was already underway. A few familiar faces greeted her with polite smiles, and she returned their nods with her usual quiet warmth. Life, as it always did after such upheavals, would go on. The village would recover, slowly but surely. The day-to-day routines of its people would return, and with time the scandal would fade into whispered tales passed down over the generations. But for now, there was a sense of change that lingered in the air. In the weeks that followed, Violet Harrow's trial made headlines across the country. The revelations about her father's criminal connections and her own dark deeds were enough to rock the foundations of the Harrow family name. There was no more talk of the Harrows as a pillar of the community. Instead, the whispers of smuggling, corruption, and betrayal tainted their once respected legacy. Violet was eventually convicted, though the charges of murder were mitigated by her emotional state and her obvious remorse. Her sentence was lighter than many had expected, and there was a quiet sense of relief in the village. Yet, despite the outcome, the scandal had irrevocably changed the Harrow family's place in Marlow. For Miss Marple, The resolution of the Ichu case brought no joy, but there was satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served. There was a grim truth in the way the world worked. People often did terrible things out of love, fear, or desperation. And while Miss Marple could understand the emotions behind such actions, it didn't change the fact that lives had been lost. There was no beauty in the end of a tragedy, only the quiet acceptance that the truth, once revealed, could never be undone. Miss Marple found herself in the garden of her cottage one late afternoon, her hands busy with a pot of begonias as she reflected on the case. The breeze carried the scent of flowers, and for a moment it felt as though nothing had changed. The stillness was comforting. It was as though the village, and indeed the world, had retreated back into a place where mysteries were only matters of the past. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. Miss Marple stood and walked to the front, surprised to find Inspector Moore standing on her doorstep. He was one of the few men in the village who had shown any interest in her investigative methods, and while their interactions had always been polite, they were never particularly close. Miss Marple had often found his rigid demeanour at odds with her more intuitive approach to crime-solving. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Moore said, tipping his hat politely. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a warm smile. "What brings you to my humble abode today?" He hesitated for a moment, looking down at his shoes before meeting her gaze. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, for your help, of course. Your observations were invaluable in solving the case. I don't know if I would have gotten to the truth without your insight." Miss Marple nodded gracefully, though she knew he didn't truly understand the full extent of her methods. He had been too focused on the evidence, on the facts, and Miss Marple knew all too well that it was often the spaces between the facts, the unspoken truths, that held the key to solving the mystery. "I'm glad I could be of assistance," Miss Marple said quietly, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "But I'm afraid the truth is often far more complicated than we like to admit. People are not always the villains they seem to be, and they're rarely the saints they wish to be." Moore's face softened, and for the first time he seemed to truly understand. "Yes, I suppose that's true. In the end, it wasn't just about solving a crime, was it? It was about understanding the people involved, their lives, their histories, their hearts." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the chase for answers. But sometimes the most important question is why someone would commit such an act. And in Violet's case, it wasn't just about the murders. It was about love, shame, and fear. She wasn't just protecting her family's reputation. She was protecting herself. And that can be a much more dangerous thing than we realize." There was a long silence between them as they both considered her words. Finally, Moore spoke again, his voice tinged with a hint of curiosity. "Miss Marple, do you think the truth ever really sets us free?" She smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible smile, and shook her head. "I'm not sure, Inspector, but I think it gives us the chance to choose how we live with it. That's all any of us can hope for." Moore nodded in agreement, though his eyes still seemed troubled, as though he were pondering some deeper question. "Well, Miss Marple, thank you again. You've certainly opened my eyes to more than just the details of a case. You've reminded me of something more important, that sometimes the answers we seek don't come from the evidence, but from understanding the people behind the crime. Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "The answer, Inspector, is always in the people. Never forget that." As he left her cottage and disappeared down the path, Miss Marple returned to her garden, her hands returning to their work with the flowers. The day's sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting its golden glow on the earth. But for Miss Marple, the mysteries of the world were never quite solved, not entirely. The more she observed, the more she realized that human nature was a riddle that could never be fully unraveled. But that was the beauty of it. The mysteries never truly ended. They simply moved on, leaving the world in quiet contemplation of its own ever-complicated truths. And so, Miss Marple, content in her own way, continued to live in the village she had long ago come to understand. There, among the flowers and the quiet hum of daily life, she would continue her observations. For in the world of mystery, there was always another story to tell, another human heart to understand. And Miss Marple, ever wise and ever watchful, would be there to unravel it piece by piece.